All right, hi guys. So, what I want to do today is now we need to talk about the American Civil War. And usually I break this up into two lectures, and that's what I've done here today. We'll get this one out today, the next one maybe later today, possibly tomorrow. I've had to trim this down. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to go through all of the battles. There's just unfortunately not enough time. You could probably do a course just of itself on the Civil War. But what I want to do for this first lecture is talk about the Civil War in the context of preserving the Union. Okay, people often say, why does the Civil War happen? And a lot of people, especially Southern supporters, get really angry at the thought, well, it happens because of slavery. Secession happens because of slavery. The South fights because of slavery. But for the North, initially, the war is about preserving the Union, in the sense that Lincoln believes after Fort Sumter that it's his duty, preserve, protect, defend the Constitution, that states, once in, never out. Once you come into the Union, you can never leave. So he then decides that after this, he has no choice but to mobilize the army, call for those 75,000 volunteers, and launch, more or less an invasion. And, that's actually, if we look at the terms of the time, they wouldn't call it the Civil War, but in the North, the War of the Rebellion, because the Southern states were then in rebellion. Whereas in the South, and I'm going to try to do a bad Southern accent here, the War of Northern Aggression. I have no idea. Never mind. Forget that accent. Never had that. That being said, go to South Carolina, find a really old person, and ask them about the Civil War. You will find more than a few still to this day that will talk about damn Yankees and the recent unpleasantness. In the South, the Civil War really holds special context because this war is going to be incredibly destructive for the South. I mean, there's a reason why today the South is the poorest region of the United States, because it has never yet anyway, fully recovered 150 years later from the damage of the Civil War. If we look at how the war begins, what we're going to see is, remember, the Deep South had seceded by February 1, 1861. The Upper South will then secede, once Lincoln calls for the 75,000 volunteers. But you're going to have some screwy stuff all over the place. Maryland will, stay in the Union, but only through force of arms. Now, Maryland's a slave state. Why is it not allowed to secede? Because Washington, D.C. was taken from land from Maryland, taken from land from Virginia. If Maryland were to secede, the United States capital would be in the middle of the Confederacy. That's a bad day. We're going to have the state of Kentucky, also a slave-owning state, proclaim its neutrality. They'll simply say, look, we'll go along with whoever wins, but we don't want to fight for the North. We don't want to fight for the South. Eventually, the South will invade, and, they'll come into the war. Missouri will see a civil war within itself because the governor is Missouri's a slave state. The governor wants the state to go to the Confederacy, but the people overwhelmingly want to remain loyal to the Union. So we're going to see militia forces and state forces battle it out. In one early battle in 1861, Wilson's Creek, both sides wear exactly the same uniform. All they did is, and I should have drawn something here, but to tell a Confederate trooper, what they would do is take the belt buckles, which, they're oval belt buckles, and they would say U.S., and they would rotate it 180 degrees. So the U.S. now formed an SN, Southern Nation. That was it. I mean, you have to be point blank range. And so we're going to see, the South is able to inflict horrendous casualties because they know who they're fighting. But in the case of the North, you see guys in blue, you don't know, are they friend or the enemy? What is it? So we're also going to see that as this war, as it, begins, what we're going to see, it's really now we're going to solve that question that I've mentioned several times. What is meant by the United States? Is it one nation, the United States, singular noun, or is it a collection of sovereign states? These states united. What is it? This war will finally decide it. Now, I don't want to get too political, okay? I consider myself a conservative. I consider myself a Republican. No way in hell will I vote for Donald Trump. The hair, it's like, if I want a guy with hair, I want Aliens guy from the History Channel. I love how, by the way, type in Aliens Guy History Channel, nothing but his picture, but nobody ever remembers what the hell his name is. But why I bring up politics is because the Confederacy shows the ultimate failure of limited government. I should more adequately say small government. It's one thing to limit a government's power. It's one thing to make sure there's not excessive government overreach. That I can get behind. But in the case of the Confederacy, they went too small or too far the other way and too small a government to be effective. Consider this. They secede because of the issue of states' rights. So that means now their constitution will reflect that. Well, how do you fight a war if individual states can do whatever they want? If states don't have to conscript people? If you say, well, we want the state to ultimately, let's go back, Articles of Confederation. We want the state to decide, okay, well, Virginia, we think you should donate 100,000 troops. Virginia's like, screw you guys. Here's 5,000. There's no mechanism in the federal government to compel the state to send troops. So states' rights doesn't work. The Confederacy doesn't tax. Why? Again, it's a state issue. And the states, they're not going to meet their quotas for recruitment. They're not going to give money, again, much like the Articles. Virginia, we think you should donate $10,000. And Virginia's like, your poor friend who owes money to you, and he reaches in his wallet and is like, hey, here's $5. That's kind of what's going on. There's also the issue that there's no true defining cause. We'll talk about this when we kind of wrap up the Civil War. What does it all mean? But, the Confederacy, once the war starts, will harken back to the fathers of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison. They'll harken back to the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. The problem is I realize I'm talking with this hand a little too much, We'll get this one in the mix. The problem is the United States harkens back to the American Revolution, harkens back to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Declaration of Independence. There's no clear-cut founding story. There's also the issue, a couple of more, that, if we look at this, the structure of Southern society, the planters, those with the most invested in slavery, pardon me, they're the politicians, they're the generals. The small slave owners or, the individual yeoman farmers who don't even own slaves, they're the ones actually going out and fighting and dying. What that means, we see this, understand the Civil War from the Southern perspective has been romanticized over the years. But the fact is that during the war, desertion was rampant in the Confederacy, especially after 1862. A lot of people no longer believe in the war, and in part it's because, this idea of, fighting to keep slavery, the people who are actually fighting the war, that almost means nothing to them. So what we're going to see is if we look, at the end, we'll talk in a second about more of the advantages, disadvantages, but because of the limited government and the failure to mobilize all of society, the Union can out-tax. We're going to get our first income tax. They can outspend, and they can outproduce the Confederacy. I'm going to say this right now, and I apologize to anybody who's, a Southern rebel, listening. I, by the way, about 100 pounds ago, was a Civil War reenactor, but I was a boy in blue. The South has no chance of winning the Civil War. At most, if they got federal recognition, and if the North quit, and if there was, foreign involvement, maybe, possibly. But the fact is, each of those things was not going to happen, for reasons we'll talk about, soon enough. Now, when we talk about fighting the Civil War, part of why the South can't win is because new technology. This is not yet industrial warfare, but the Industrial Revolution is occurring. It is happening. We have all sorts of just new fancy gadgets. What's the Will Rogers quote from the 1920s? You can't say that human civilization doesn't advance. In every new war, they find a new way to kill you. Here in the Civil War, we see something very similar. In terms of combat, people are still going to use those Napoleonic tactics. Have one infantry line, have another. You blaze away till somebody runs. The problem is we have things like this. I'm trying to point, it's not. Things, whatever. Things like on whatever side of the screen happens to be the correct one. I quit. I quit. It's Friday, despite the fact I might appear drunk, no, I'm not. I do take my job seriously. I'll drink after the video. Anyways, what we're going to see, we have things like this. The rifle musket. Not the rifled musket, not the musket, the rifle musket. It's a bit shorter than a flintlock, but because of new technological improvements, you can make the barrel out of steel, and it's much, much, much easier to rifle. Now, every infantry soldier can have a weapon that it still shoots that same 3 rounds a minute, but you have something that you can reach out and tag somebody at 600 yards. This is a great thing from a military technological standpoint. But now the problem is you have those same tactics of let's have 2 infantry lines at 100 yards, but things are accurate out to 6. The casualties are going to through the roof. It's going to be horrendous. You've also got now what would be called the mini ball, or as from the original French, the Minet ball, the first conical bullet. That now means you can have accurate fire, it's quick to load, and the wounds are very, very deadly. One of the things that they would do, okay, if you imagine like we're looking top, say we're looking top down. No idea what that is, but top down, 2 infantry lines fighting, okay? So this would be, one, I just forgot. Oh, God, what's the term? Whatever. One side versus the other. Well, typically what they would actually want to do is get on somebody's flank, so like this. That way, say your line's 100, muskets long, but here your line would only be 2 muskets deep. So you've got 100 just firing in. These muskets were so powerful, especially from the stuff like this. This is an 1861 Springfield rifle musket. That what you would actually, yeah, it's an 1861. That what would happen is if you took, and I believe it was the Discovery Channel did tests on this a few years back, that a 58 caliber mini ball fired at a range of about 200 yards into the flank of somebody would hit somebody in the side, go through them, okay, blow out the other side, go through his buddy. Bear in mind, you're standing shoulder to shoulder. Go through him, blow out him, and then go and lodge about halfway into the guy beside him. One shot, and you kill or wound 3 people. And I mean, these are lead balls, so that's lead poisoning, It's the 19th century, okay? Rum and a bone saw is your Obamacare. If you took a mini ball, okay, let's say you took one here in the shoulder or the upper arm, what would happen is because black powder, it's an explosive, not a propellant, is when it would hit that bone, it would bleed off most of its velocity. Break the bone, but then it didn't have enough to escape, and so it just moves along the bone, just shattering the bone. That's why, you see so much about just arms and limbs being amputated. That's all you can do. So you've got that. You've got cannon with now exploding shells, longer range, better accuracy. You now need artillery spotters. I mean, they're still on the infantry line, but, these artillery duels now happen at much, much longer ranges. You'll get things like the magazine loading repeating rifle. So here's like a Spencer carbine, which is actually the first with a detachable magazine. What you would do is you would take this magazine and load it in the butt of the weapon, just push it in, snap it till it clicked, and then it's a lever action, cock the hammer, and you're good to go. Or you'd have things like the Henry rifle, which, the joke was because it held so much ammunition compared to, the rifle musket, which is single shot. People would say you would load it on Sunday and you could shoot it all week. You have the rise of ironclads, which I don't know if you can see in the video behind me. I've got a copy of a Civil War board game behind me, not a nerd or anything. Iron and Oak from GMT Games. Thank you guys. If anybody buys it, you owe me royalties, but whatever. Unfortunately, these aren't going to do enough to get YouTube ads, so if they do, I can just retire. But whatever. Anyways, where was I? You're going to get the rise of ironclad ships. These predate the Civil War, but, by the 1850s. But now technology means that you can take ships and build them out of iron. In the case of the USS Monitor, think Battle of Hampton Roads in 1862, Monitor v. Virginia, or as it was when I learned it as a kid, the Merrimack. Why? Why the 2 name conventions, by the way? Because the Merrimack was a Union ship burned to the waterline to prevent its capture. The South raised it, built a new ship on top of it, and named it the Virginia. Now, here we can kind of see between these two the difference between the North and the South. In the North, you could custom make this. In the South, to make ironclads, what they would do is rip up steel rails from railroads and then just interlock them along the hull and say, yeah, it's good enough. It's clad in iron. I mean, quite literally, these guys are the first Pinterest nailed it memes. They're ugly. They're slow. They are, I mean, God, I can't even think of an appropriate, PC thing to say here. I mean, it's just, it looks like your Uncle Jim Bob built the damn thing. They work, but they're not pretty. And so what we're going to see, why this is so important, is technologically, the North is the one able to build all the rifle muskets. The South has to import them. The North can build all the cannons. The South has to import them. The North can build all the magazine breech-loading rifles. South has to import them. Ironclads, North can custom make them. The South, it's like, what all parts do we got lying around? I mean, that's basically how it's going to be. We're also going to see that this is, if it's not industrialized war, it is still the first modern war. And what I mean by that is because, artillery spotting, you're going to have, aerial balloons, able to spot artillery fire. They'll communicate with semaphore flags. We're going to get trench warfare. It's going to look exactly like World War I. You're going to have a lot of grievously injured and wounded people. Late in the war, contrary to that stupid History Channel Civil War game, you will get Gatling guns. They'll never see combat, but they are made. I mean, we know that we can do this. Now, death is still going to come from mostly disease. And that's something that's going to stay there well until the First World War, maybe even after. But what this means is because it's Americans fighting Americans, it's just an absolute slaughter. And war is also, you could say total war, because it touches every piece of society. We don't see mass mobilization in the North. But by 1864, you're going to get a guy we'll talk about later, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who will say, his idea is literally burn the South down. Destroy the crops, destroy the plantations, tear up the railroads, bring war to civilians. Because the idea of total war is, injure the civilians so they say that too much is too much and they pressure the political leaders to quit. Downside, it realistically, it doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way. I mean, the Germans are going to say the same thing in the Battle of Britain. Let's bomb London till the civilians quit. We'll say the same thing when we bomb the hell out of Germany in World War II. Here, the South doesn't, the civilians don't make the politicians quit. But, it will be so bad that, as Sherman will say, it is good that war is so terrible. Or, sorry, he would say war is hell, and it's good that war is hell, lest we should grow too fond of it. He realized that war is starting to change from this chivalric thing to something that's just a really, really nasty, ugly business. Sherman's also the guy, by the way, one of my favorite quotes, and I got to do something to try to get laughs, because we're talking eventually about around 650,000 people dying, so it's hard to be too humorous, too much levity here. But Sherman's going to be the type of guy that he will say something, this will also be one of the first wars. You're going to have newspaper correspondents embedded with the war. They're going to send back stuff to their newspapers. And Sherman hated these guys. And he would say once that I'd like to round them all up and have them shot for treason. But I won't do it because by hell I'll be getting, or by noon or by morning, I'll be getting reports from hell. Really should edit these videos when I screw up the punchline, but whatever. So if we want a graph to kind of show some of these advantages and disadvantages, okay, the Union has 22 million people to 9 million Confederates. But if we extrapolate that to the free, so that is a little over 2 to 1, 21.7 to 5.6. That's almost 4 to 1 population advantage for the North. Not to mention, if we look for the Confederacy, over 1/3 of everybody in the Confederacy is a slave. So, I mean, that you can't arm slaves, because if you do, why the hell did you secede in the first place? If you arm slaves, a slave is, one, not going to fight for you, not that well anyway. Two, You put a gun in his hand, he's not going to go back to picking cotton. So they can't arm slaves. So that means by population, the North can win a war of attrition. If we look at the soldiers, they're able to conscript 2 million to 1 million. Why can't the South conscript more? Because you've got to have somebody to work the farms, manage the slaves, keep enough people to counterbalance the slaves. Again, with 1 million soldiers, that's 4.6 million whites to 3.5 million slaves. That's a 1-to-1 ratio. From the Southern perspective, you don't want any less than that, because what's to prevent a general slave uprising? If we look at railroad, most of it in the North, manufactured 90% to 10, firearm production 97 to 3. All the South can do is grow a ton of cotton. And that's what they use to trade with Europe. But the problem is, and it's lucrative, sure, but cotton doesn't fight a war. You can load up a musket with cotton and shoot it, but it's not going to kill a guy 600 yards away. So what we see is the North can just build more stuff. Look at these numbers. There is no way the South will ever rise again. It's just most of the stuff is in the North. When we want to talk about, the Civil War, there's a few battles I do want to mention. And in this lecture, I'm mostly going to focus on Bull Run and Antietam. Now, not to say that I'm biased, but I'm biased. And so this is the only time, really, you're going to get, I'll mention it, but this is the only time in print you're going to get the two naming conventions. If we look, this battle starts the Civil War naming convention. Because what will happen, the North will, you cite the nearest creek to where the battle took place. The South will, cite the nearest town or railroad junction. So the first battle of Bull Run Creek, or the Manassas Junction. Now, the call for volunteers goes out in April of 1861. And everybody thinks it's going to be a quick and short war. They're only called up for 90 days. At this Bull Run, we're going to see that people will literally flock in from Washington to watch the battle. They think it's going to be fun. And for the first part of the battle, it goes how most people expect. The Union Army, it's defeating the Confederates. It's doing fantastic. But now we see, again, the problems of technology and why, with technology, you don't have short wars. Manassas Junction, there's a railroad junction right there. And so what happens is General Thomas Jackson, we better know him today as Stonewall, what he does is he brings reinforcements at the exact time by train, and these reinforcements turn the tide of the battle. How how he gets his name is as he's pushed back, the Confederates are pushed back. They see Jackson, just standing there with his guys, and someone says, "Look over there, there stands Jackson like a stone wall." This idea, stay there, stand, don't retreat. Now, why the trains are so important is if you look, if I can find my mouse cursor, okay, historically, if you've got to fight a battle, you've got to fight it with what's there. Troops can only march about 3 to 5 miles an hour, generally 2 to 3. So if you realize there's a major battle going on here, and you call for reinforcements from Richmond, this would take, pardon me, it's like 1:20 and I'm boring myself. I'm sorry for you guys having to listen to this. It would take days to march these troops up. But now you have trains that can move 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. You can cover this in a couple of hours. You have telegraph. So at Bull Run, they can send, hey, we need assistance, and a few hours later, troops can be there. Technology will be what wins the Civil War. And so the Union forces flee. They quite literally run back to Washington. It becomes a rout. The army is all but shattered. But the Confederates are too tired to pursue. And so what was supposed to be the one battle of the American Civil War, unfortunately, stalemates and leads into a much, much longer and deadlier war. A couple of fun, interesting things. I talked about, spectators. And they would just literally picnic out and just watch the battle. They thought it was great fun. Supposedly, there was a Union artillery officer that a newspaper reporter is like, what are they doing? It's like, congressmen, people might come out to watch the fun. I know what they deserve, but I can't spare the ammunition. Imagine, you're fighting a battle for your country, and there are people watching. Civil War reenactment makes sense. Actual Civil War, little out of place. Just a little out of place. So how does the North decide to try to beat the South? Enter again General Winfield Scott, the same guy that goes into Mexico in 1847, the same guy that's fighting in Canada in 1814. He is the chief of staff of the United States Army. And what he proposes is a naval blockade. Pretty much, it's called the Anaconda Plan. It'll be named after, more or less a great snake, if you will. The idea is just simply strangle and, cut off the South. All the South can do is grow cotton. The idea, they take that cotton, they export it out, and use that to buy in weapons or whatever. Keep foreign influence out, keep weapons and stuff out, and the South must crumble. The North can feed itself. The North is self-sufficient. The South is not. Now, there's a couple of interesting conundrums with this. One, the North doesn't have that many ships. It never will have enough ships to ensure that this blockade can be airtight. But the South helps them with that. How do they do that, you might ask? Imagine, if you will, okay, you're a ship owner. What is it? Butler, whatever his name is from Gone with the Wind. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. So, okay, you're a trader. You go to Europe, you buy your goods, you come back. Now, why does the South secede? Slavery. Well, why don't they just give up slaves? Money. Greed. Okay, so if you're let's assume that greed is still there. You go to Europe. What's going to get you more money? Guns and ammunition for your government, or luxury items that the South has not had access to for a couple of years? The latter. So what we're going to see is, for every ship that runs the blockade, only about half or so are actually bringing in stuff the South needs. Everybody else, sorry, God. The lecture is boring when, right? I should edit all this out, but I figure it's more fun to just see the uncut raw version. So what we're going to see is, for the South, the same people want to keep making money, and that will undermine the war effort completely. There's also the issue, like I mentioned, of foreign involvement. Specifically, the only real way the North can win, or the South can win, is if they get foreign aid. So they apply. We want recognition. We want you to say we are our own nation. We want money. We want military troops. We want ships. We want arms. We want everything. The issue is, that's not going to happen. Europe doesn't mind selling weapons to both sides. Why? Because the 1860s see a revolution in firearms technology. The move away from muzzle-loading paper cartridge muskets to metallic cartridge breech-loading weapons. The forerunners of the modern stuff we have to this day. So what we're going to see is, because that, Europe has no problem just dumping everything it's got into the United States. But they're not going to give recognition. Why? England banned slavery in the 1840s. France did sometime around the same time. The United States was an anachronism. We held on to slavery years and years and years after almost everybody else. Because of that, Europe is going to give us a cold shoulder. They do not care about the plight of the South, because how will it look on them to recognize the South would legitimize this whole thing about slavery. Now, if we talk about, and I should have had a picture, but if we talk about, this idea of stuff for profit, okay, there will be some close diplomatic incidents. Britain will build ships for the Confederacy. Most of them get through, but there will be some, like the Laird Rams. These are blatantly warships, not just stuff merchantmen taking over made blockade runners, but actual warships. And the Union will say in 1863, if you deliver these to the Confederacy, we will go to war. We will, these are states in rebellion. It's an internal matter. We will go to war if we have to. All right, sorry about that. I decided to walk away a little bit, didn't want to keep yawning my head off. So I think it's allergies, but it's Oklahoma. I'm allergic to the whole state. Anyways, so in the case of the Laird Rams, what we're going to see is, eventually Britain will just seize them. Britain will just take them over. They don't want the company to lose money, the Laird Company. But it's this idea that the Union is willing to go to war in an effort to ensure that, the Confederacy does not get overt military assistance or, actual foreign recognition. And part of that is thanks to Charles Francis Adams, who's the son of John Quincy Adams, the longtime president and then congressman. He's also a senator at one point. The guy just won't stay out of politics. He keeps, he was the ambassador to Britain. He largely keeps Britain neutral. And why that's so important is Britain had been the Confederacy's largest supporter. Britain wanted to undermine the Union. Britain wanted, to keep the Union from becoming economically dominant. But they have no love for slavery. They don't want the Confederacy to necessarily win, but they don't want the Union to just have an easy time of it as well. And the Union doesn't have that much of an easy time of it, because what we're going to see is, although I've got here, understand this, the Civil War is won in the West. That's where the Confederacy will be split in two. That's where we're going to see a lot of the huge battles, the emergence of someone like Ulysses S. Grant. But the thing is, the fighting is generally characterized by fighting for the capitals, because you've got Washington, you've got Richmond, and that's where, most people think of when we think of the Civil War. But the West is critical right now because we see the emergence of Ulysses S. Grant. And Grant is one of my favorite characters. He's a bad general. He's also a drunkard. I'm pretty sure he thinks he's holding up that pole right now. And it's not that he drank a lot. He's the ultimate lightweight. He is a cheaper date than my wife. Which, okay, so I haven't told a wife story lately. Why do I say that? Because when my wife and I got engaged, this would have been years ago, a friend of ours bought us champagne. I'm a big fat guy, so I can, booze, I'm fine. She takes 2 glasses, passes out, wakes up 30 minutes later, and in the groggiest, most hungover voice on the planet, "What day is it?" I love her. I'm never going to let her forget that story. But to me, that's what Grant was. 2 drinks, this guy is done for the day. And it was well known in the Union Army. Now, like I said, he's not a great general. And why is that? Because he believed hardcore in the war of attrition. Never mind tactics. Never mind strategy. Just, if I have 3 times as many guys as the other guy, I'm just going to throw my dudes in. Wow, dudes, what is this? The 80s? Not the 1880s, but I'm going to throw my guys in and just human wave assaults and eventually break them. And we see that at Forts Henry and Donelson, which, if I can find my thing, Fort Donelson and Fort Henry, right up here. And, this shows that Grant can lead. It shows that Grant can be successful. And it's why Grant will eventually, in late 1863, take over command of the whole Union Army. Not just yet, though. Now, the thing is, why these battles are so important, and I mention them, is we see the loss of 14,000 troops for the Confederacy. Remember, the Union has 2 million eventually. 14,000, drop in the bucket. They can replace it. 14,000 for the Confederacy, that's a problem. Now take the 14,000 plus how many dead plus how many wounded, and we start to see the Confederacy, which has to realistically, if it wants to win, fight a defensive campaign, stay in its own territory, wear the Union out. They cannot afford these losses. Grant, through his policy of attrition, can turn in these losses. We're going to see battles like Shiloh and Corinth. And Shiloh is particularly, troubling because it scares people in the Union, because Shiloh was only the second battle in human history where you would have, troops, the several 100,000 troops. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 that led to Napoleon's final defeat saw, on both sides, several 100,000 troops. It took British, French, Prussian, Belgian, Dutch, all of these people, to make up these numbers. This battle was simply Americans fighting it out. And so for many people, this is how bad the war is getting. But Shiloh will be a drop in the bucket to things like Gettysburg. There will be more and more Shilohs. The war is turning in huge, massive casualties. huge, major battles. And so what we're going to see is it just by 1862, the realization this is not a short war, this is not a quick war, this is not just simply a domestic between North and South. This is a major, deadly confrontation. But take away from this with Grant, the war is won here in the West because it starts here in 62. By 63, we'll talk about the seizure of Vicksburg. And it's this. I mean, this is what rampages the Confederacy. We're not going to get a breakthrough over here in Virginia until late 1864, whereas at the same time, Union troops are going to come through here, and eventually, they're going to just take over most of Georgia, and we'll begin Sherman's, what would be called the March to the Sea. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but blockading, remember, that's still what we want to do. Blockading is how we plan to effectively beat the South. But our blockade, the Northern blockade, is not that successful, but, stuff always makes it into the Confederacy, even through the last days of the war. But they never come in the quantities they need to. It's all reliant on cotton. And what we're going to see is it's that over-reliance on cotton. Eventually, the South will start to be like, well, you need to give us stuff or you're not going to get our cotton. And Britain will say, that's fine. We own Egypt. You can grow cotton there. We own India. We can grow cotton there. And this will actually destroy the cotton market. So it's that ironic thing. They want a civil war to keep slaves to grow cotton. But through the process, they destroy the cotton market, which means even if they got to keep their slaves, it would not matter. Now, as I said, I believe in the last lecture, most of the good leaders go to the South. The good military commanders, that's the only real Southern advantage. So what we're going to see is with the Army of the Potomac, which is the main Union army fighting in the Eastern Theater, there's this constant struggle to try to find a good Union general. General McClellan will be the guy most associated with it, but he's going to be fired. They're going to bring in somebody else. That guy gets fired. McClellan comes back. It's ridiculous. It's like they call it a breakup for a reason, okay? But it's like that friend. We all have them. I'm having to deal with a friend of mine right now, just like that dumps her boyfriend or his girlfriend, and then give it about 2 weeks and they're back together. Or in the case of this friend, and I feel bad for her, in a 72-hour period. No, actually, it was about, let's be fair, 96-hour period. She went from my boyfriend's cheating on me to we worked everything out to we're engaged to he left me for his ex again. That's kind of what it's like with General McClellan. It's not going to work. You dumped him for a reason. Lincoln knows he fired McClellan for a reason. And McClellan is a bad general. This is McClellan, okay? And for McClellan, we're going to see things like the Peninsular Campaign, where they'll actually go invade near Yorktown in Virginia, march here. We're going to see things like the 7 Days Battle, where he's going to win battles on 6 of the 7 days, and he still gets thrown out of Virginia. He constantly believes he doesn't have enough troops, even though he has like twice as many as the Confederacy in the region. And he keeps asking, I need more troops, I need more troops, I need more troops. He does so little that Lincoln, in his first appointment before McClellan comes back, will say, if General McClellan isn't going to use the army, would someone mind asking him if I could borrow it for a little while? McClellan is that bad. And unfortunately, a lot of the other guys we're going to talk about, McClellan, Pope, Hooker. By the way, when we get to Chancellorsville, General Hooker, let's just say that Hooker was fine with lots of comfort women hanging around the military camps, providing sexual favors. That's where the term comes from. Prostitute, that's why we call them hookers, because of General Hooker. It comes out of the American Civil War. Now, what we're going to see is McClellan, to show just kind of how idiotic he was. Probably his, worst thing comes at Antietam, which, Antietam is the single bloodiest day in American military history. September the 17th, 1862. Just realized the anniversary was that a couple of weeks ago, and I completely forgot about it. Oops. Now, with Antietam, okay, there will be a quiz question on, I believe, your second, maybe third quiz, and it will say, what is the deadliest battle in American military history? The answer to that is the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. 26,000 Americans dead in 47 days. But the deadliest single day, the single bloodiest day in American military history will be this. 5,000 Americans dead, 18,000 wounded. Remember how I said, and if you don't, that's fine. Just say it right now. I'll listen. But remember how I said the South needs to fight that defensive campaign. The problem is that defensive campaigns don't solve the problem. Defensive campaigns, are reliant on the other guy to wear himself out at his leisure. So Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, takes his army north, comes up, bypasses Washington, and invades Maryland. And his hope is pull the Union Army away from Maryland, and then he can then move his army, get between the Union Army and Washington, D.C., and the Union forces will have no choice but to attack. That's what his plan is. Except his battle plan is discovered. Literally, Union forces find it wrapped up in a cigar. How you find stuff wrapped up in a cigar, I don't know, but there you go. They show it to McClellan. McClellan says, well, I don't know if we can do this, but he doesn't do anything to flank. He doesn't do anything to try to do anything. Instead, he just commits to a frontal assault. This battle, how it's horrendously deadly. We're going to see things like here, fighting in the cornfield. Now, this diorama is set early in the battle when the corn's about head high. By midday, the corn would have been here, and it was said you could walk through the cornfield and never touch the ground because you would always be stepping on bodies. So many people were killed or died there. Killed or died, good God. Killed or wounded. You're going to see things like Burnside's Bridge, where Ambrose Burnside will just fling, hundreds and thousands of guys to take this one bridge and just desperate frontal assaults and just be mown down. In the Civil War, you want to be on the defense because attacking, driving into rifle musket fire is one of the worst things you could experience. If we look at the dead, the casualties, it's just horrific. People are going to be slaughtered en masse. This, again, single deadliest day for a reason. 5,000 dead, 18,000 wounded. Tactically, it's a Confederate victory because the Union forces are bloodied. But strategically, it's a Union victory because Lee has no choice but to retreat. The Union Army is now between him and Virginia. His supply lines are cut. He's exhausted. He has to fall back. So the Union claims it as a victory. Now, why this is so important, what I expect on your exams for the significance is why this is significant is it allows Lincoln to go through with his military necessity of an Emancipation Proclamation. With the Emancipation Proclamation, what we're going to see is Lincoln realized he has to somehow reshape the war. He's got to do something to keep foreign powers out. He's got to do something to get more people to volunteer. All the really patriotic people had volunteered already and been mustered out by now. They answered the call in 61, 90-day enlistments, 6-month enlistments, they're done. Lincoln needs something to bring people together to join the cause. So for him, he decides it's freeing the slaves. Now, not all of them. Sorry, I just found a bug bite here, and I'm like, what is this? Ow, that hurts. He doesn't free all of them. But what he says to do is if we can make the war about freeing some slaves, we can do one of two. We can roll the dice and do one of two things. We can either get people in the North to maybe join for moralistic reasons, or we can get the South to want to come back in before we do this. Now, the thing is, Lincoln said we have to do this from a position of strength. That if we did it from after losing, we're going to look pathetic. It's not going to work. We needed a victory. But the Union Army is doing so horrible that the closest they can get to a victory is going to be Antietam. To quote Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, Mr. President, you call Antietam a victory. Let me remind you that a few more such victories would have ruined us. Antietam is like barely a victory, but it's enough. The proclamation is enacted September 22nd, 1862, and says that effective January 1, 1863, all slaves in states or parts of states then in rebellion shall be free. This does not nor will not free a single slave. Well, in the South, the North doesn't have any power. There's no way to actually enforce it. But what about those states? Remember, states then in rebellion. Parts of states then in rebellion. What about Missouri? What about Kentucky? What about Maryland? What about Delaware? What about West Virginia? By the way, Virginia, when it opted out, the people in the western part of the state were more loyal. They said, screw you guys, and seceded from Virginia. What about parts of Tennessee that had already been recaptured? What about what might be captured again by January 1? This isn't about freeing the slaves. This is either about if the South will come back in, then we'll say, look, we won't free the slaves. The war is over. Hooray. If they don't, you can then make the war about freeing the slaves. But right now, it's done simply as a military necessity. Briefly, I want to talk about Fredericksburg because we're going to talk about one of my favorite generals, if for only one reason. After Antietam, Lee retreats. McClellan slowly moves after him. Because of that, Lincoln fires him for the final time. He says he has a case of the slows, which, he's slow to attack. I get that. It also makes me think give him a laxative because, when I have a slow, it hurts and I'm on a... Never mind, bad poop joke, I tried. And it's going to be replaced by Ambrose Burnside, whom I love because Ambrose Burnside certainly had a way for facial hair. And it became so, renowned that people wanted to copy the Burnside. And then at some point, somehow in American history, it got switched. And these no longer became called Burnsides, but sideburns. This is, again, where that term comes from. If you go get your haircut and they say, do you want sideburns? Named after this guy. So with Fredericksburg, Burnside wants to launch yet another assault. Why the idea? Just keep hammering the Confederacy. So December 1862, we're going to mount an attack in Virginia. I'm going to see if, and I should have thought of this earlier, but Peninsular Campaign. We've got Petersburg. Yeah. Right here's Fredericksburg. An idea, never mind this peninsular stuff. Let's just frontal assault, go. But with Fredericksburg, you've got to cross a river. And so what we're going to see is the Confederates put up one hell of a fight here. Union troops have to ford the rivers. They then have to mass up. And, the Confederates fall back outside of town and take position on a stone wall. And not alone a low one, but a stone wall about yay high. Perfect to just rest a musket on. Accurate fire, most of your body's protected. And the North has no choice but infantry bayonet charges against these positions. Just on and on and on. This lasts for days. And eventually Burnside has no choice but to gather his shattered troops, pull them back, and retire. 12,000 killed, wounded, or captured. This is horrendous. But these are losses the Union can replace. But it also means Burnside is now fired and they're going to bring in somebody else. What we're going to see happen is the North starts to wonder, is the Confederacy unbeatable? People in the North start to wonder the same. And Lee, Lee, by the way, is leading this. The Army of Northern Virginia is the main opponent in most of these battles. The Army of Northern Virginia, he starts to believe that perhaps the A&V is invincible. It's hubris. He makes a blunder, and all of this is going to come out with the Battle of Gettysburg, which will be both the turning point of the Civil War as well as, should we say, the high watermark of the Confederacy. So what I want to leave off just really quickly is this kind of explains why the war has to transition from preserving the Union to freeing the slave. Where it's simply not going well preserving the Union. You don't have enough troops. You don't have people fighting their best. By 1862, the war is stalemated. The Confederacy cannot successfully take Washington. Union forces cannot successfully take Richmond. Volunteers are starting to go home. Most of them because their enlistments are up, and some re-enlist. but many don't want to serve under incompetent Union officers. So now that the South does not come back in with the Emancipation Proclamation, now Lincoln begins to play up those abolitionist sentiments. Now he switches from being an anti-slaver to an abolitionist and basically says, look, we need to make the war about ending slavery. Because if we do, perhaps those abolitionists will now join up. Perhaps people willing to fight and die, fight and die for other people. What is it? The line at the original line, not the modern line we like to say, but the original line from the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I'm talking about, Jesus. And as he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Now we like to say, and let us live to make men free. But originally, let us die to make men free. This idea, it would be a noble, worthy cause. It's also done because by 1863, the North will have to start drafting people. And we'll talk about that more in the next lecture, but that's going to be far from popular. But now there's also the issue with transition war and slavery. If the Civil War were to end, okay, or when it ends, can you leave slavery intact? Or would doing so risk yet another civil war? That's the problem. Nobody for sure knows. So Lincoln now tries to change the war from the Northern perspective anyway, from preserving the Union to now freeing the slave. And it's this idea of freeing the slave and bringing it into the Civil War that we'll pick up with next time. I might get that lecture out today. It might take till tomorrow, but I will try to have, by the end of this week, the Civil War finished up for you guys. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. Please, if you've not read the announcement, sometime within the next week, just shoot me an email just with, what movie you'd like to do for your term paper. That way, generally I'll approve most things, but I just want to make sure that they're appropriate. If you've got any questions, let me know. And as always, I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.